The war had lasted for centuries. The Zarkari Dominion and the Veltran Alliance had fought for so long that no one even remembered how it started. Planets burned, fleets shattered, and millions died. But still, no side could win. The war had become a cycle of destruction. Every victory was met with another defeat. Every conquered world was soon lost again. Peace was impossible because neither side could afford to stop. Their leaders had spent too many years feeding their people with promises of ultimate victory. And so, the war continued. On the battlefield, soldiers fought without hope. They did not believe in victory anymore. They fought because that was all they had ever known. Commander Zorak of the Zarkari Dominion stood on the bridge of his warship, the Hammer of Wrath. His golden eyes scanned the burning wreckage of another lost battle. His fleet had attacked the Veltran stronghold of Droska 5, but the enemy had pushed them back. Again, he clenched his fists. Another failure. This war will never end, his second-in-command, General Korth, muttered. Zorak didn't reply. He couldn't, because deep inside, he knew Korth was right. On the other side of the war, High Marshal Vexa of the Veltran Alliance looked at her own losses. The Veltran forces had defended Droska 5, but the cost had been too high. Hundreds of warships had been destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were dead. She stared at the holographic map of the galaxy, showing all the battlefronts. Nothing had changed. Her people cheered her name, celebrating their victory. But she knew the truth. There was no victory in this war. And then, everything changed. A new faction had arrived. A species that had stayed neutral for a long time. Humanity. They were small in number. They had never fought in this war before. But now, for some reason, they had decided to step in. They sent a single message to both sides. Surrender now, or we will end this war ourselves. Zorak laughed when he saw the message. Humans? End this war. Ridiculous. Vexa also ignored it. They are weak. They do not understand true war. Neither of them knew that humanity had already made its move. The first sign was subtle. A few ships disappeared from the battlefields. No distress calls, no wreckage. Just gone. Then, entire fleets vanished. The Zarkari and Veltran forces sent scouts to investigate. None returned. And then, the first planet went dark. A heavily defended world, where millions of Zarkari soldiers were stationed, simply stopped responding. No explosions, no invasions, no signals. One moment, it was there. The next, it wasn't. Panic spread through both factions. Who was doing this? What kind of power could erase entire fleets without firing a single shot? For the first time in centuries, the war paused. Zorak and Vexa, the two greatest commanders of their time, finally asked the question they had ignored before. Who are the humans? And more importantly, what have they been hiding? For the first time in centuries, both the Zarkari Dominion and the Veltran Alliance felt something they had long forgotten. Fear. The war had never stopped before. It had raged on without pause, without hesitation. But now, entire fleets were disappearing. Planets were going dark, and no one understood how or why. The humans had given only one warning. Surrender now, or we will end this war ourselves. Both factions had ignored it. Now, they were realizing their mistake. On board the Hammer of Wrath, Commander Zorak stood in front of the holographic war map. His golden Zarkari eyes flickered as he looked at the list of missing fleets. In just 3 days, his forces had lost 2 major fleets, 5 outposts, and an entire colony world. No wreckage, no distress signals, no survivors. Just gone. General Korth, his second-in-command, stood beside him, his voice filled with frustration. This is impossible. Even the Veltran Alliance does not have this kind of power. Zorak didn't respond. His mind was racing. The Veltrans weren't responsible. They were suffering the same losses. That only left one possibility. The humans. Zorak's claws tightened into fists. He had studied them before. A minor species, barely recognized by the greater galactic powers. They had never fought in this war. They had no large fleets, no powerful empires. And yet, they were wiping entire armies off the battlefield. How? We need answers, Zorak growled. Prepare a scouting fleet. I want to know what the humans are hiding. Korth hesitated. Commander, what if the fleet does not return? Zorak's jaw tightened. Then we'll know what kind of enemy we're facing. On the other side of the war, High Marshal Vexa of the Veltran Alliance sat in the war room of the Star Fortress Valkyr. The fortress was one of the most secure military installations in the galaxy, surrounded by thousands of warships. Yet she felt no safety. Reports flooded in, Veltran fleets missing, entire armies erased without a trace. Even their greatest dreadnought, the Sunblade, had vanished. It was impossible. The Veltran Alliance had survived the war for centuries. They had faced every weapon, every strategy. But this was something new. Vexa turned to her intelligence officer. Have we received any transmissions from the humans? The officer shook his head. None since their first warning, High Marshal. They have gone completely silent. Vexa exhaled slowly. The humans had issued one warning. No second chances, no diplomacy. What if they weren't bluffing? She had underestimated species before. She had seen weaker civilizations develop unexpected weapons. But nothing like this. She looked at the war map. The Zarkari were suffering the same fate, and that meant there was only one solution. She opened a secure transmission to Commander Zorak. The war between the Veltrans and the Zarkari had lasted for centuries. They had never spoken without threats or weapons drawn. Until now. Zorak appeared on the screen, his golden eyes burning with suspicion. Vexa folded her arms. I think we have a common enemy. Far away from both factions, in a hidden base deep in space, a group of human officers watched the war unfold. They stood in a dark command center, screens glowing as information poured in. One of them, Admiral Elias Kane, smiled. Looks like they're finally paying attention, he muttered. Beside him, a woman in a sleek black uniform nodded. They never thought we were a threat. Kane's smile widened. They do now. She tapped the screen, showing the latest casualty report. It wasn't a list of human losses. It was a list of their targets. Veltran and Zarkari forces were vanishing at a frightening speed. The war, which had lasted for centuries, was now collapsing in mere days. The woman turned to Kane. Should we send them another warning? Kane shook his head. No. He leaned forward, watching as entire enemy fleets blinked out of existence. Let them feel fear a little longer. The silence between Commander Zorak and High Marshal Vexa was thick with tension. These two leaders had fought against each other for centuries. Their people had spent generations killing each other. And now, they were forced to talk. Neither of them liked it. Zorak's golden eyes narrowed. So, Veltran, you're finally admitting that this war is out of your control. Vexa scowled. Do not pretend you are in control either, Zarkari. Your fleets are disappearing just as fast as mine. Zorak clenched his jaw, but said nothing. She was right. Both of them had underestimated the humans. The war map in front of them displayed a terrifying reality. Entire battlefronts were simply gone. The massive fleets that once clashed endlessly had been erased without a sound. The humans had not sent an army. They had not launched an invasion. They had done something far worse. They had removed their enemies like ghosts in the night. Vexa folded her arms. We need to know how they're doing this. Zorak's claws tapped against the table. I sent a scouting fleet to investigate. Vexa's eyes flickered with curiosity. And a deep growl rumbled from Zorak's throat. They never came back. Vexa inhaled sharply. That meant only one thing. The humans had taken them too. She turned to her intelligence officer. Send every available scout. I want to know how they fight, how they move, and most importantly, Her eyes narrowed. Where they are? Across the galaxy, in the depths of a silent battlefield, a single Zarkari scout ship drifted. Its engines were dead, its communications offline. Inside, the crew huddled together in the dark. They had been searching for signs of the missing fleets when they had seen it. A human warship. But it wasn't like anything they had ever encountered. It made no noise. It emitted no energy signatures. It moved like a shadow, passing through space without a single ripple. And when the scout ship had tried to run, the human ship had done something impossible. It had disabled their vessel instantly. No weapons, no explosions, just a single pulse of energy, and everything had gone dark. Now they were floating, helpless, as the human ship hovered beside them. The Zarkari captain, a hardened warrior named Gralvok, had never known fear before. He felt it now. His crew whispered among themselves, their voices shaky. What do they want with us? Why haven't they destroyed us? Gralvok didn't have answers. He could only stare at the human warship, waiting for whatever came next. Then suddenly, a voice echoed through the ship's communication system. It wasn't in the Zarkari language. It wasn't in Veltran either. It was human. You are not our target. Tell your leaders. The war is over. Surrender now. Then, without another word, the human ship vanished, and the Zarkari scout ship systems came back online. Back at the Star Fortress Velker, High Marshal Vexa received the scout's report. She listened in silence as Gralvok described what had happened. The silent warship, the energy pulse, the eerie message. Her officers were shaken. Even the most battle-hardened generals looked unnerved. Vexa turned to her chief scientist. How is this possible? The scientist hesitated before answering. I don't know. No technology in the galaxy works like this. The humans are using something beyond our understanding. Zorak, who was watching from his own war room, exhaled through his nose. They have never fought in this war. They have never built fleets to match ours. But somehow, in the shadows, they have built something else. Vexa nodded grimly. Something powerful enough to end the war in days. For the first time in centuries, neither side was thinking about how to win. They were thinking about how to survive. On the hidden human command base, deep in uncharted space, Admiral Elias Kane watched the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. Humanity had never been a major power in the galaxy. The larger empires had ignored them, dismissing them as a weak and fragile species. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed humans would fight like everyone else. Kane leaned back in his chair, watching the war map update. The Zarkari and Veltran were scared. Good. Beside him, a female officer smirked. How long before they surrender? Kane chuckled. Not long. Let them run. Let them panic. His eyes gleamed as he watched another Zarkari fleet disappear from the battlefield. By the time they realized the truth, he exhaled slowly. It will already be too late. Across the vastness of space, chaos was spreading. The Zarkari and Veltran empires, once locked in an endless war, had suddenly been forced to confront a terrifying reality. They were no longer in control. For centuries, both empires had fought with unmatched brutality, wiping out entire planets, destroying fleets without hesitation. They had believed themselves to be the most powerful forces in the galaxy. But then the humans arrived. And the war had changed overnight. On the Veltran capital world, High Marshal Vexa sat in her war room, staring at the latest reports. Fleet after fleet had vanished without a trace. Some ships had returned, but only to deliver the same haunting message from the humans. The war is over. Surrender now. Her advisors were panicking. Generals shouted over each other, arguing about what to do. Some wanted to retreat. Others wanted to launch a full-scale attack against humanity, but no one knew where to strike. Because the humans didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't conquer planets. They didn't send armies. They just removed their enemies. Vexa clenched her fists. We need to find them. We need to know how they are doing this. Her intelligence chief hesitated before speaking. We sent an infiltrator team to one of the human outposts. Vexa's golden eyes sharpened, and the intelligence chief swallowed. They didn't come back. A heavy silence filled the room. Vexa exhaled sharply. Then send another team. Double the numbers. I want answers, and I want them now. Her generals hesitated. They had never seen her so desperate before. But the truth was, for the first time in her life, Vexa was afraid. Meanwhile, on a hidden Zarkari warship, deep within the void of space, Commander Zorak was facing his own crisis. He had gathered his best warriors, his most brilliant strategists. Together, they had spent days trying to analyze what was happening. But nothing made sense. The humans were using no known weapons, no energy-based attacks, no fleet maneuvers that could be countered. Nothing. One by one, entire warships were disappearing. Even their most advanced stealth ships had been hunted down. Zorak growled, slamming his fist on the table. I refuse to believe this. We have dominated this war for centuries. We are warriors. We do not lose to a race that has never even fought before. His second in command, a scared warrior named Vrelok, hesitated. Commander, we have a prisoner. Zorak's eyes snapped to him. A human. Vrelok nodded. Yes, we found a small human outpost on a distant moon. The team captured one of them before the others. Vanished. Zorak rose from his seat. Take me to him. Now. Inside the cold, dimly lit prison cell, a single human sat, his hands bound in energy restraints. He looked young, barely past 30. But his eyes carried an eerie confidence. He was not afraid. Zorak stepped inside, towering over him. Tell me how you are doing this. How are your people destroying my fleets? The human smirked. I don't think you'll like the answer. Zorak snarled. Tell me, or I will tear the truth from your mind. The human simply leaned back. You think this war was about who was strongest? He chuckled. That's your first mistake. Zorak's claws twitched in frustration. Then what is it about? The human's smile widened. It's about who understands the battlefield better. Before Zorak could react, the prison alarms blared. Red warning lights flashed. His communicator crackled. Commander, we have intruders. Zorak turned sharply. Who? Where? The voice on the other end was panicked. We don't know. They're inside the ship, but no one saw them arrive. Zorak felt a cold dread settle in his chest. He turned back to the human prisoner. But the human was gone. Only his restraints remained, neatly placed on the chair. A single message was scratched into the metal table. Checkmate. Across the galaxy, on the secret human command base, Admiral Elias Kane observed the unfolding events. Did our agent escape? One of his officers asked. Kane smirked. Of course he did. The officer exhaled. They must be panicking by now. Kane nodded. Let them. We don't need to fight their war. We just need to make them realize. He tapped a finger on the war map, watching the Zarkari and Veltran forces scattered like frightened animals. That the war was over before it even began. The battlefield was no longer a war zone. It was a graveyard. Where once thousands of Zarkari and Veltran warships had clashed, there was now only silence. Floating debris from destroyed ships drifted aimlessly in the void. A few crippled vessels flickered with failing power, their crews sending desperate distress signals. But no one was answering. The war, which had lasted for centuries, was now collapsing in a matter of hours. And no one knew how. High Marshal Vexa sat frozen in her command center, staring at the war map. Entire fleets had vanished. Some of her best admirals had sent their final transmissions, screaming about shadows in space before their signals were cut. No enemy fleet had been detected. No weapons had been fired. The humans were hunting them without ever showing themselves. A cold sweat dripped down her spine. How could they fight an enemy they couldn't even see? Her intelligence officer rushed in, looking pale. "Hi, Marshal, we intercepted a human transmission." Vex's golden eyes snapped to him. "Play it." A deep, calm voice echoed through the command room. "This war is over. You have two choices: surrender or vanish like the others." The message ended. Silence. Vex's claws dug into the metal armrest of her chair. The humans weren't negotiating. They weren't making demands. They were simply stating a fact. On the Zarkari warship Bloodfang, Commander Zorak stood on the bridge, his heart pounding. He had fought in more battles than he could count. He had torn apart enemies with his bare hands. He had never once hesitated in war. But now, his entire fleet was gone. The humans had taken everything from him, without ever engaging in a proper battle. No direct assaults, no grand strategy, just disappearances. Commander, his second-in-command, Vrilok, spoke in a low voice. "We need to retreat. We need to regroup and—" Zorak slammed his fist on the console. "Retreat to where? There is no battlefield left." His voice was filled with rage, but underneath there was fear. For the first time in Zarkari history, they were losing without ever having a chance to fight. And then, the lights on the Bloodfang flickered. The crew tensed. A chilling silence spread through the bridge. Then, the ship's AI shut down. The emergency lights switched to red. Vrilok's voice was tight. "Commander, something is on our ship." Zorak growled. "Intruders." "How?" "Our security is." The air in the room shifted, and suddenly, a human soldier was standing in the middle of the bridge. No alarms had triggered. No doors had opened. He was just there, dressed in black armor, his helmet obscuring his face. He simply raised a single device in his hand and pressed a button. Instantly, every weapon system on the Bloodfang went offline. The crew panicked. Screens shut down. The ship's reactor began to fail. Zorak lunged at the human, claws out. But before he could reach him, the soldier disappeared, vanishing into thin air. The only thing left was a small data pad on the floor. Zorak picked it up with trembling hands. One message was displayed on the screen. "Your war is over. Choose wisely." Back on the human command base, Admiral Elias Kane watched the operation unfold. His soldiers had infiltrated every major enemy ship without firing a single shot. The war had been a game of intelligence, precision, and fear, and humanity had already won. An officer turned to Kane. "The Zarkari and Veltran forces are breaking apart. Some are surrendering. Others are running. What are your orders?" Kane took a deep breath. "Let them run," he said, "but make sure they know there's nowhere left to hide." The officer nodded. "And the ones who refuse to surrender?" Kane's eyes darkened. "Then they vanish like the rest." The battlefield was silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of total annihilation. The mighty fleets of the Zarkari and Veltran were gone. Their warships, once symbols of power, now drifted as burning wreckage in the cold void. Some had been destroyed. Others simply vanished. No distress signals, no escape pods, just emptiness. And the worst part, no one had seen it happen. The humans had erased entire fleets without revealing themselves. Aboard the Veltran warship Eternal Spear, Grand Strategist Ralvik stood frozen. His long silver fur was damp with sweat as he gripped the edge of the command console, his sharp mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His fleet, one of the strongest in Veltran history, was gone. Not destroyed in battle, not forced into retreat. Gone. The war map, which had once displayed thousands of Veltran and Zarkari warships, was now empty. The only markers left were human vessels, few in number, but everywhere. "Sir," one of his officers shouted, "something is." The lights flickered. A deep, unnatural hum vibrated through the ship's walls. And then, darkness. The entire ship lost power in an instant. Every console, every screen, every system shut down. Panic spread across the bridge. Officers barked orders, but their voices trembled. Ralvik forced himself to stay calm. Activate emergency. He stopped. The emergency systems weren't responding. The Eternal Spear, one of the most advanced warships in the Veltran fleet, was now a floating coffin. A faint blue glow filled the bridge. Ralvik turned, his heart pounding. A human stood there. No alarms had triggered. No doors had opened. He was simply there. The soldier's armor gleamed under the dim emergency lights. A glowing holographic interface flickered around his wrist as he calmly observed the room. Ralvik's officers froze in place. No one moved. No one dared. The human tilted his head slightly, then raised a small device. With a single press of a button, the entire ship's reactor went offline. Ralvik felt his knees weaken. How? How were the humans doing this? The soldier turned, his visor reflecting Ralvik's stunned expression. A voice, distorted and cold, echoed through the bridge. This war is finished. And just like that, the human vanished. On the Zarkari warship Bloodfang I, Supreme Commander Vrexis gritted his teeth. He had never feared an enemy before. Not when his people had fought for centuries. Not when Veltran forces had turned against them. Not even when entire planets had burned under his command. But now he was terrified. Because he was no longer in control. The humans had stolen the battlefield from him. Zarkari warships were disappearing, their crews helpless against an enemy they couldn't see. Every attempt at a counterattack had failed before it even began. Human technology was beyond comprehension. They moved through ships like ghosts, erased fleets without leaving a trace. They weren't fighting a war. They were ending one. Vrexis slammed his fist against the console. "Where is the human fleet?" he snarled. His officers exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. Vrexis growled. "I ask you a question." A low, trembling voice finally answered. "Yes, sir. There is no fleet." Silence fell over the bridge. Vrexis narrowed his eyes. "Explain." The officer swallowed. "The humans aren't using a fleet like ours. We thought they had battleships. But that's not what's attacking us." He hesitated. "They're using something else." Vrex's claws dug into the armrest of his chair. "What do you mean?" The officer took a shaky breath. "They're not here to fight us. They're here to erase us." Meanwhile, aboard the human command vessel Erebus, Admiral Elias Kane stood before a massive holographic display. His officers watched in silence as entire enemy fleets crumbled without a single human casualty. Their technology, their tactics, everything was superior. The war had lasted for centuries. Humanity had ended it in 5 hours. A young officer turned to Kane. "Sir, they're breaking. Some are trying to surrender. Others are retreating." Kane's gaze was cold. "And what about the ones who refuse to surrender?" The officer hesitated. "They're still searching for us, sir. They think they can fight back if they find our fleet." Kane exhaled. "Then let them search." He turned away from the display. By the time they realized the truth, his voice dropped to a whisper. They won't be alive to understand it. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. The Zarkari and Veltran empires, once powerful and unchallenged, now had nothing left to fight with. Their once mighty warships were either drifting in the void as lifeless wrecks or had simply vanished without explanation. The war, which had lasted for centuries, had been reduced to a 5-hour nightmare. And in that nightmare, only one truth remained. Humanity had arrived. Aboard the Veltran flagship of Eternal Spear, Grand Strategist Ralvik stood in the silent ruins of his command center. The power had returned, but it no longer mattered. There were no commands to give, no fleets to lead. His people, his empire, everything he had fought for, all of it had collapsed in mere hours. Screens flickered to life around him, showing fragmented distress signals from scattered Veltran warships. He recognized the voices of his fellow commanders, voices filled with panic, confusion, and fear. "They are inside our ships. We don't know how. Our weapons aren't responding. They don't even need a fleet. Please, we surrender. We. The screen went dark. Ralvik took a slow, shuddering breath. Surrender? It was a word that no Veltran had ever spoken in this war, but now it was the only word left. And the worst part, he didn't even know who he was surrendering to. Meanwhile, aboard the Zarkari warship Bloodfang Supreme Commander Vrexis faced his final decision. His fleet was gone. His officers were dead or missing. The Zarkari Empire, once feared across the stars, was now silent. And yet, he still refused to accept defeat. His claws tightened around the armrest of his command chair. His remaining officers stood in silence, their eyes darting toward the flickering holographic screen in front of them. A single message had appeared, simple, direct, and unmistakable. Your war is over. Surrender or be erased. No threats, no warnings, just a choice. Vrexis bared his teeth. The humans had destroyed his fleet, outmatched his strategies, and crippled his empire, but he would not beg. His second-in-command, a young officer named Lorik, swallowed nervously. Sir, we have no weapons left, no defenses. If we don't surrender, we will be. Silence, Vrexis growled. His heart pounded. His pride screamed at him to fight to the last breath. But his mind, his logical, strategic mind, knew the truth. Fighting meant nothing if the enemy could not be fought. He exhaled sharply and pressed a trembling claw to the control panel. This is Supreme Commander Vrexis of the Zarkari Empire. We surrender. Aboard the human command vessel Erebus, Admiral Elias Kane stood with his arms crossed as the final surrender transmissions arrived. The war, the centuries-long war that had consumed entire civilizations, was now over. And it had ended without a single human casualty. A young officer turned to Kane, his voice cautious. Sir, the Veltran and Zarkari commanders have officially surrendered. Their forces are in complete disarray. What are your orders? Kane's expression remained unreadable. He had no hatred for the Veltran or the Zarkari. Humanity had never wanted this war, but they had been forced into it. And now that they had entered the battlefield, they had rewritten the rules. Begin occupation protocols, Kane ordered. Secure their fleets, their planets, and their leadership. No unnecessary bloodshed. He turned to another officer. And make sure every species in the galaxy sees what happened here today. The officer hesitated. Sir, are you saying we should make this public? Kane's gaze was cold. Yes, the galaxy needed to know what had happened, not just to warn others, but to make sure no one ever made the same mistake again. Across the galaxy, thousands of civilizations watched in stunned silence as the war's final moments were broadcast. The Zarkari and Veltran had spent centuries fighting for dominance. They had burned planets, enslaved species, and rewritten history in their favor. And yet when the humans arrived, the war had ended in 5 hours. It wasn't just victory. It was a message, a warning to every empire, every warlord, every species that thought they could challenge humanity. And the message was clear. We are not your enemy. But if you force us into war, it will be the last war you ever fight.